So this would be an introduced species, right? Are you legally allowed to introduce? You want to bring back the passenger pigeon. There's the technical side of things, but at the end of the day, are you going to be allowed to do it?
Yeah, well, that is one of the leading questions that has yet to have like a definitive answer. I mean, it's right now the answer would be it's it's is that when we get to that point, it's really just up to the authorities who make those decisions. But those decisions, at least here in the United States, in the U.S., all wildlife, all natural places belong to the public. There are people that privately own land, of course, but if if you own land, you don't own the animals on it, because they're transient. They'll get off your land, and go to someone else's land. So wildlife in general is a public asset. And so when decisions are made about management of wildlife or public habitats, national parks, for instance, national forests, grasslands, that comes down to the support of the American public. So if the American public really wants something to happen, they have a certain amount of influence over it. But it's also, they are also voting in representatives, and we've hired people in certain agencies to also make those decisions, because no one's going to vote, on every salamander reintroduced to a particular park.
Although this is a fairly emotive topic, I imagine people will jump on this.
Yeah, I mean it will be complicated. But there are potential regulatory pathways to start going down. The unique thing about this is people do introduce new species into environments. It's happened many times, and it's happened many times as sanctioned by governments to do for various purposes. So there are ways to do that, particularly for conservation purposes. However, the animals will be gene edited, and so there's new regulations that have been kind of emerging to try and talk about, like, okay, well, how do we handle that? Like, we know that in the United States, we grow genetically engineered crops. And
so maybe in Europe it would be more of a problem than in the States.
It might be more of a problem in Europe than the States, but it's hard. It's really hard to tell. I have spoken at European meetings before where people have been considering how gene editing changes our views of the organisms that we're making. It's not like old genetic engineering technologies. But I will say that right now, the United States is leading the world in the fact that, as I said, we have GMO crops that are growing, and those are growing throughout the world. It's not just the U.S., but never before has a genetically engineered organism been released to the environment in order to save a species or a habitat. It's
but
never
there have
been
been
done
releases,
for
right?
conservation.
There's fish that have been released that were modified, no?
Oh no, those fish are not released. They're contained.
But there's accidental releases that have happened.
Not of genetically engineered animals.
Okay.
So yeah, people have released fish, animals all over the globe for various purposes, but for genetically engineered, no, it's there's never been any genetically engineered animals released in an unsanctioned or sanctioned way to a wild environment. There have been genetically engineered mosquitoes released to control populations, but those are mosquitoes that are engineered to be a dead end. They're sterile, they reproduce, and it's over. So they don't spread. They don't actually become part of the environment. Right now in the U.S., a project is going to potentially be the very first time that a genetically engineered organism is released to the environment, and it's the transgenic American chestnut tree.
Okay.
So this tree was once one of the most abundant trees in the eastern United States. It inspired, it actually inspired, the song for Christmas, "Chestnuts roasting on an open fire." So it's culturally and ecologically significant, but in the early 1900s, a fungal blight disease got introduced to the United States from Asia on Asian chestnut trees that were brought here as ornamental trees for cities and parks. And that disease obliterated the American chestnut. Over 99% of every American chestnut in the world was wiped out.
These Chinese viruses.
Yeah. And well, that's another interesting topic. Many of the worst diseases do come out of Asia because it's such a large landmass with so many varied environments. And the species there have a long history with those diseases. But anyway, yeah, so this disease gets to the U.S., wipes out the chestnut tree. It's a few stragglers have survived in a couple pockets. Some of them because people actually took chestnuts and transplanted them out of their range, so they were far away from the disease. And none of that was conservation back then, but it was just lucky. Yeah. And then about 30 years ago, William Powell got, working with a guy.
Who was he, sorry?
William Powell's a genetic engineer, botanist at the State University of New York. And he got a call from a man who found a chestnut surviving on his land and said, I want to figure out some way to save these trees. And so they started studying how the fungus kills the tree and found that the fungus releases an acid into the tree. And that's what ends up killing the tree. And it just so happens that most plants in the world have an enzyme that breaks down that acid.
I see.
But the chestnut tree in America, it hadn't needed that enzyme for eons, so the gene just broke down. That's what happens when you don't, literally in genetics, if you don't use it, you lose it. That is a general rule of evolution.
And so now we have this modified tree.
Yeah, so they found that they took a functional copy of that enzyme, put it into the tree, and they've produced trees that are 100% immune to this disease, that can now be restored to the environment. And they applied to do this to the USDA. It went through public comment period just a few months ago. It closed. Just a couple of months ago, it closed. And that's being processed. And so it's, there's a few agencies other agencies that are all interplaying into the approval of this, but we're within possibly a year or two or less of people being able to plant these transgenic chestnuts in their yards, and the government being able to use them to replenish these trees in state forests and national forests and private land. And so in the next century, a tree that was once one out of every 4 trees in the Appalachian Mountains could be completely restored, growing back up in those areas. And it's been missing for, 100 years at this point. And that's all because of genetic engineering. And that's really what's setting the precedent for this is people are realizing with issues like disease in birds in Hawaii from avian malaria transmitted by mosquitoes. Disease actually, it's pretty prescient right now with an emergent virus causing a pandemic for humans to actually, just kind of say that emergent diseases and the spread of diseases have been one of the number one issues facing wildlife for the last few hundred years. Because as human beings connected every part of the globe, they brought animals and their diseases with them and pests, and exposed these species that had never seen these diseases before to it, just like we've all been exposed to a disease our bodies have never been seen this before this year. The thing about wildlife, though, is nobody's making a vaccine for the Christmas Island rats that got wiped out by disease brought by invasive rats 100 years ago. So it is a major challenge. Climate change is making it worse. And genetic engineering like this, gene editing, it offers ways to give these animals a leg up to survive and then be able to adapt. In fact, the term we use for that is called facilitated adaptation. And so, the need to do that right now is actually, I think, paving the way for getting to the point where we have a legal system that will, have a direct path to saying, okay, I now have a gene-edited passenger pigeon that I want to put into the environment. And there's now a precedent. Okay, well, we put the gene-edited tree into the environment. Now here comes the pigeon, and we've made the whole forest.
escaped sapiens.